In 1940, with France overrun and German armies poised to invade England, Britain stood alone. Except that it wasn't Britain that stood alone, it was the British Empire that stood alone. In 1939, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India, and every other constituent part of the empire went to war with Nazi Germany. Should Panzer divisions seize London, the British royal family was to be evacuated to Canada. This never happened, of course. German troops set foot in Britain only as prisoners of war. But Britain's gold and silver reserves were evacuated to Canada, specifically to Nova Scotia in 1940 in what was then known as Operation Fish. And while the importance of the British Empire to the war effort has faded in public memory, at least in Britain, at the time it was very apparent. Take this excerpt from Churchill's finest hour speech, delivered shortly after the disaster at Dunkirk in 1940. "If this island," he says, "or a large part of it be subjugated and starving, then our empire beyond the seas, armed and guarded by the British fleet, would carry on the struggle." There are a couple reasons why the empire's contribution has faded from public view. This really was their finest hour, as Churchill put it, a heroic moment of defiance against what then seemed to be an unstoppable German advance. But while Britain is still here 80 years later, the empire is not. Its disappearance is still mourned by those in Britain nostalgic for imperial greatness, when Britain was not just a small island off the coast of Europe. Imperial nostalgia was one part of the movement in support of Brexit. Certainly fear of immigrants, mostly from former British territories, of course, was another big part. Its goal is to essentially free the UK from the European Union so that it can re-establish old ties with former dominions. A shared British language and culture still bind these places together, along with a couple archaic rules. Canadians, for instance, can vote in British elections, even if they're just in England on vacation. The British Commonwealth still exists, of course, but their ties are loose and growing apart. Most Commonwealth members, Australia included, have signaled that they will consider leaving the Commonwealth on the death of Queen Elizabeth II. The empire's collapse has also been accompanied by rising shame and guilt over its former atrocities. This is seen most readily in calls to remove statues of imperialists like Cecil Rhodes, who on his death endowed scholarships to Oxford in his name. You can also see examples of this in the recent Black Lives Matter protests in Britain, which call for a reckoning with the nation's imperialist past. There were always voices in Britain critical of empire, who thought expansion abroad a waste of time or money, or who believed that claiming territories that were not yours to begin with was inherently wrong. But one thing that might come as a surprise to us as we study this globe-spanning realm is that most Britons at the empire's height do not seem to have had any strong feelings about it at all. Except in times of grave crisis, like the impeachment of Warren Hastings, the Boer War, or the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857, British newspapers rarely covered imperial events. The British press was much more concerned with events in Europe or the United States. Imperial wars got scant coverage, which should perhaps not be much of a surprise to us, since much of the fighting was done by Indian sepoys, both in India and in Africa, where sepoy regiments were sometimes sent to enforce order in annexed territories. At the end of the 19th century, many within the British government fretted that their countrymen had no idea of what was going on in the empire, and would therefore not care very much if the empire one day collapsed. The colonial secretary, Joseph Chamberlain, sought to bolster public support with parades and holidays. Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee in 1897 featured Indian elephants and representatives from the far corners of empire. But it was only after the Boer War exposed the limits of British power that this coalesced into regular efforts to raise public awareness. In 1904, the British government established Empire Day, celebrated on Queen Victoria's birthday. This was meant to be a celebration of the blessings of empire, but even then it had an air of nostalgia, a feeling that Britain was losing its grip. The same impulse can be seen in the establishment of the Boy Scouts by Robert Baden-Powell. The motto, "Be prepared," was actually taken from the South African police, and young British men were expected to be prepared for the challenges that the 20th century would bring, of which there would be many. The spectacle of empire grew more outlandish as its power grew more distant. In 1924, the government sponsored the first Empire exhibition in Wembley, a World's Fair with the Empire as its showcase. This was followed by a second exhibition in Glasgow in 1938. By then, many attendees might have wondered how long the colonies represented would actually continue to fly the British flag. By 1938, New York had replaced London as the center of the global economy. Gandhi's nonviolent protests were making India ungovernable in the long run, and the regions that many white Britons thought of when they imagined their empire, Canada, Australia, and so on, were effectively independent, though cultural and sentimental ties remained strong. Moreover, should nationalists elsewhere in the empire seek to violently overthrow British rule, the yawning technology gap that characterized Britain's 19th century expansion, spear-wielding modists against rapid-fire Maxim guns, had closed. In 1945, the British Empire in its current form appeared untenable. Britain had won the Second World War, but it emerged from the conflict heavily indebted to the United States. Many of its major cities had been severely damaged by German bombing. London's East End, for instance, would take years to rebuild. Wartime rationing ended in the United States at the end of 1945, but it wasn't until 1954 that wartime rationing ended in Britain. And with India having received its independence in 1947, Britain found that it could not afford its remaining imperial commitments. I've mentioned throughout this course that British policymakers saw India as the crown jewel of their empire. This was exactly right. The Indian army, paid for by Indian taxpayers, was responsible for keeping order elsewhere in the empire. Britain was also dependent on Indian revenue to fund a host of other projects, from roads to railways to civil service salaries, and indeed any infrastructural project across much of sub-Saharan Africa and East Asia. When India received its independence in 1947, this revenue stream disappeared. Any imperial troops sent abroad would have to be raised in Britain and paid for by British taxpayers. And Britain was bankrupt in 1947. At first, the British government sought to avoid this reality by any means possible. No longer able to dispatch Indian troops to do Britain's fighting, the British government after World War II actually used Japanese POWs to bolster European empires in Southeast Asia. The Allies had fought the war against Japan with the assistance of nationalist guerrillas in Burma, Indonesia, Malaya, and elsewhere. But when the war was over, those nationalists thought that they should receive their own independence from their former European overlords. The Dutch, French, and British thought otherwise, and when Indonesian nationalists rose up against their former Dutch rulers in the autumn of 1945, the British army sent thousands of Japanese POWs into action against them. This, however effective in the short run, was not exactly a solid long-term strategy, and by 1947, most Japanese POWs had been repatriated. Other British policymakers thought that they might recoup their losses with revenue from Middle Eastern oil. Britain's direct involvement in the Middle East stretched back to its occupation of Egypt in 1882, but it really began in earnest only during the First World War. The Ottoman Empire had entered the war on the side of the Germans, and the British encouraged Sharif Hussein, the guardian of the Muslim holy cities of Mecca and Medina, to rise up against his Ottoman overlords. This was accompanied by a vague promise that Britain would recognize Arab independence after the war. This campaign was immortalized by the British officer T. Lawrence, known romantically as Lawrence of Arabia, whom the British dispatched to serve as Hussein's advisor. When the war was over, though, independence did not come so easily. The Hejaz under Sharif Hussein did become independent, but other former Ottoman provinces were divided between the British and the French according to a secret treaty signed in 1916 between the British Mark Sykes and the French Francois-Georges Picot. This treaty came to be known as the Sykes-Picot Treaty, and its effects still influence the modern Middle East. Britain and French colonial possessions were formally recognized as League of Nations mandates, where the two colonial powers were charged with the task of training Arabs to govern themselves. The British received Palestine, Jordan, and Iraq, which would fight a brief rebellion against the British in 1920. The British also secured control of Iraq's vast oil fields, and a joint Anglo-American company, Aramco, would also own plenty of oil-rich deposits outside of British territory, most notably in Iran and Arabia. Of these Middle Eastern mandates, the most tumultuous would prove to be Palestine, which had been promised during the First World War as a national homeland for the Jewish people. The cabinet had issued the Balfour Declaration, as it was called after its designer, Arthur Balfour, to curry Jewish support for the war effort, and it contained a clause that insisted that nothing would be done to deprive the existing population in Palestine of their rights. As Jewish immigration increased between the two world wars, tensions between Jews and Palestinians exploded into violence, with the British forced to wage a losing battle separating the combatants. The British would eventually seek to curb future Jewish immigration to Palestine, most devastatingly during the run-up to the Second World War. Though after the conflict was over, Jewish partisans began demanding total independence. Here, as in India, British policy morphed into finding an immediate exit strategy, especially after Jewish guerrillas blew up the King David Hotel, the British headquarters in Jerusalem. The British government simply didn't know what to do with its mandate. After mulling over various solutions, including a partition of Palestine, the British formally turned over their mandate to the United Nations. And in April 1948, the new nation of Israel declared its independence. Oil revenue, though significant, was ultimately no substitute for revenue from the Indian subcontinent. So the British latched on to a third possible remedy, closer alliance with the United States. The US emerged from World War II more powerful than ever before, its booming economy having fueled the war effort. It was now the most powerful state on Earth, despite a growing challenge from the Soviet Union. Wartime ties were strong. The special relationship between Winston Churchill and Franklin Delano Roosevelt extended well into the post-war period and has dominated Anglo-American relations ever since. But this special relationship is very much a partnership between a senior partner, America, and a junior partner, the United States. In 1945, this was not how British policymakers envisioned it. Instead, they imagined that they might rule their empire jointly with the Americans, with American money providing a much-needed boost to the British treasury. Failing direct assistance, the British could at least secure a respected place dispensing wisdom to the new American imperialists. The future Conservative Prime Minister Harold Macmillan spoke for many when he opined that these Americans represent the new Roman Empire, and we Britons, like the Greeks of old, must teach them how to make it go. Unfortunately for Macmillan, the Americans were not especially interested. Independence movements like the one Gandhi had led in India had considerable American support, and newspapers like the Chicago Tribune strenuously condemned British imperialism and its empire abroad. Though the UK and the US would engage in a few joint operations, including the overthrow of the elected leader of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, who was threatening to nationalize Anglo-American oil companies there, the US government imagined Britain as its junior partner at best. This was nowhere more apparent than in the Suez Crisis of 1956. Britain had granted Egypt its independence shortly after the First World War. This was seen as less expensive than maintaining control over the Egyptian bureaucracy, and Britain could maintain effective power by controlling the Suez Canal zone, into which much of the world's shipping between Asia and Europe went. The Khedive of Egypt was recognized as king after 1922 and would be reliant on British loans to fund his debauched lifestyle, one that featured wild parties and a garage of gold-plated Rolls Royces. But in 1952, the Egyptian king was overthrown by a clique of army officers led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, an Arab nationalist who sought to unite the entire region under his control. 4 years later, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal zone and kicked the British garrison guarding it out. Seeing this as a challenge to British power abroad, the Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, concocted a scheme with France and Israel to seize back control of the canal. Israel would invade Egypt, and British and French paratroopers would drop in at the Suez Canal to quote-unquote separate the combatants. Eden thought his scheme would restore British prestige, but he had failed to consult President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was furious once the fighting began in October 1956. Eisenhower feared that the Soviets might back Nasser and prompt a nuclear war, and he threatened to sell off America's pound sterling reserves, which would have caused the pound to collapse and effectively destroy the British economy if Eden did not immediately withdraw, which he did. Eden resigned, and Britain found that it could no longer act independently in the world as a great power. The resulting 2 decades saw the emergence of dozens of independent countries as European powers withdrew from their colonies in Africa and Asia. British colonies like Nigeria, Tanzania, Uganda, Botswana, and the Sudan would receive independence during the first 2 decades after World War II. Faced with an economic crisis in the late 1960s, the Labour Prime Minister Harold Wilson renounced Britain's commitments, quote-unquote, east of Suez, a play on the line from Rudyard Kipling's poem The Road to Mandalay, which featured a lovesick British soldier yearning to be shipped somewhere east of Suez, or the best is like the worst. The transition to independence was often peaceful, at least for the British. Communal violence and subsequent civil wars were another matter, but there were a few occasions when the British fought to retain their position. This would occur either when Britain's opponents were communists, as they were during the Malayan Emergency of 1947 to 67, which ended with a British victory and the prompt granting of independence to a non-communist government. The Cold War shadow being quite strong here. Or in areas with significant white settlement. These latter included Kenya, where white farmers had settled in the so-called White Highlands during the early 20th century. In 1952, a secret society that claimed to represent the interests of Kenya's dominant ethnic group, the Kikuyu, rebelled against the British colonists. Many sought to drive the white farmers out by force. The British government ultimately suppressed this group, which came to be known as the Mau Mau, with unbridled ferocity. They forced thousands of Kikuyu civilians and suspected Mau Mau fighters into concentration camps, where many were tortured. Resistance was crushed by 1956, but with long-term British power there seemingly untenable, and with Kenyan whites only a small minority, the British government agreed a few years later to grant independence under conditions of majority rule. Jomo Kenyatta would come to power as the first post-independence ruler of Kenya. The idea that Kenyan whites could be governed by the black majority provoked outrage among other white settlers in Africa. This was no more apparent than in Rhodesia and South Africa, 2 places with widespread segregation through much of the 20th century. The British government had little say in what went on in South Africa, an independent dominion that in 1948 established the formal system of apartheid. When Prime Minister Harold Macmillan sought to encourage apartheid opponents in 1960 by making his Winds of Change speech to the South African Parliament in Cape Town, declaring that majority rule was Africa's inevitable and just future, South Africa responded by leaving the Commonwealth. Things were more complicated in Rhodesia, which was not a dominion but did possess its own white-dominated legislature. Whites formed no more than 8% of the total population, but Rhodesian whites were determined not to submit to majority rule. When the British government outlined a plan in 1965 for just that, the Rhodesian Prime Minister, Ian Smith, issued a unilateral declaration of independence from Britain. Ian Smith's new Rhodesian state lasted for only 14 years. Black nationalists, led in part by Robert Mugabe, launched what was called the Rhodesian Bush War, which made large swaths of the countryside effectively ungovernable for the Rhodesian central authorities. By 1979, the British government intervened to secure a peace deal between the two sides and oversaw the creation of the new state of Zimbabwe, which formally came into being in 1980. Robert Mugabe would rule Zimbabwe as dictator until his death in 2019. The collapse of the British Empire abroad would lead to fissures at home. The ties that bound the peoples of the British Isles together would fray during the 20th century, especially in its latter half. This was most obvious, of course, in Ireland, which had received its independence, effectively at least, in 1922, but the United Kingdom would also face a growing challenge from nationalist movements in Scotland. The British Empire was crucial for Scotland's economy during the 19th and 20th centuries. Much of the Royal Navy and Britain's merchant marine were concentrated and constructed in the vast dockyards of Glasgow. Scots held imperial posts everywhere the British flag flew. But the decline in British power also meant a decline in the economic foundations that underpinned it. A diminished Royal Navy spelled doom for Glasgow, which never recovered from its industrial collapse at the end of the 1960s. With no empire and no apparent external threat, some in Scotland began to wonder whether their country might be better off without the British connection. The Scottish Nationalist Party emerged to press for devolution, the creation of an autonomous Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh. This was achieved in 1997, the same year the British Crown formally returned the famous Stone of Destiny, seized by Edward the Longshanks 800 years earlier. The Stone of Destiny was the stone upon which Scottish kings were crowned. The SNP would begin pressing for total independence in the years that followed. But even though the SNP controls a majority of Scottish seats in the British Parliament, much as the Irish Parliamentary Party had once done, it would lose an independence referendum in Scotland in 2014. The nationalist cause, though, is still alive and well, having received a new lease on life in the overwhelming Scottish support for remaining in the EU. Nicola Sturgeon, the leader of the SNP, is currently demanding a second referendum under the new conditions imposed by Brexit, and the EU flag continues to fly over Scottish government buildings in Edinburgh. Despite occasional outbursts of overheated rhetoric, the Scottish nationalist movement has been almost entirely peaceful. Independence advocates have put up statues of William Wallace and Robert the Bruce all over Scotland in recent years, but nobody is advocating a repeat of the actual battles of Stirling or Bannockburn. The same, alas, has not been true for Northern Ireland. We last discussed Protestant rule in Northern Ireland in the context of the Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921, where Ulster was given the opportunity to remain within the United Kingdom. The British Crown created a devolved government for Northern Ireland based at Stormont and Belfast, though Ulster would continue to elect MPs for the British Parliament. Ulster Protestants used their dominant position at Stormont to systematically deprive Catholics of any role in government or in the police. Lodges like the Orange Order also discouraged Protestant employers from hiring Catholics for any position in middle management or above. This very much kept Catholics as a repressed underclass. By the 1960s, discontented Catholics and their Protestant allies looked to the civil rights movement in America as an example. A Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association emerged to peacefully press for equal rights for Catholics, sponsoring demonstrations in Derry, Belfast, and other cities. These were typically met with violence from Protestant militias, who in turn faced violence from a group calling itself the Provisional IRA, which was formed in 1969. At first, this violence was fairly small in scale. People threw stones at each other and engaged in fistfights. But with communal tensions appearing to spiral out of control, the British government abolished the Stormont Parliament in 1972 and imposed direct rule. British troops arrived to separate the combatants, but the British leadership appeared to openly side with Ulster Protestants. Of the 3,000 youths detained for street fighting in the early 1970s, not one was Catholic. In January 1972, the Civil Rights Association sponsored a huge rally in Derry in protest, but with processions banned by British authorities, a squad of paratroopers ordered the demonstrators to disperse. When they refused, and when paratroopers claimed, falsely as it turned out, to have spotted IRA snipers, the British troops opened fire, killing at least 15 people. This became known as Bloody Sunday, the second one in Ireland's long 20th century history. Bloody Sunday effectively destroyed the civil rights movement. Ivan Cooper, the Protestant head of the Civil Rights Association, admitted as much in the protest aftermath, telling reporters that he felt ill-equipped to preach nonviolence to any young Irishman who wanted to join the IRA. This marked the beginning of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, a nearly 30-year-long guerrilla war between the IRA, Protestant militias like the UVF, and the British Army. In 1979, the IRA assassinated Lord Mountbatten, then the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland. This is the same Mountbatten I discussed on Tuesday in his capacity as the last Viceroy of India. In 1984, the IRA even attempted to assassinate the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, killing or wounding several members of her cabinet at a bombing of the annual Conservative Party conference in Brighton. When Thatcher remarked afterward that she was lucky to have escaped alive, the IRA issued a warning. "Today we were unlucky," they said, "but remember that we only have to be lucky once. You will have to be lucky always." But by the mid-1990s, it was apparent that the conflict was a stalemate. Neither side could defeat the other. With American assistance, all parties to the conflict, including the independent Republic of Ireland, signed a power-sharing agreement that came to be known as the Belfast Accords. These were approved in 1998. Both Catholics and Protestants were guaranteed equal representation in local government. IRA and UVF prisoners were amnestied, and every British citizen in Northern Ireland would also receive Irish citizenship and the right to vote in Irish elections. The border was demilitarized, with border crossings between Northern Ireland and the Republic being no different than crossing between Wisconsin and Illinois. This meant that Irish nationalists could effectively pretend that they had won, rather than just received a stalemate, and were living in the Republic of Ireland, since they had Irish passports, voted in Irish elections, and could travel the 2 hours it takes to get from Belfast to Dublin on any random Sunday afternoon. This open border was all fine and good while the UK and Ireland were both members of the EU, with its commitment to free travel between member states. But now that the UK is no longer part of the EU, the border question is a real problem with no easy answers. If the UK leaves the border open, then it has an open border with the EU where goods and people can travel with no hindrance, a backdoor of sorts that defeats the purpose of Brexit. But if they close the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, a new generation of Irish nationalists, especially those who belong to the split-off group called the Real IRA, have signaled that they'll start the war again and shoot at border checkpoints and any British soldiers that are posted there. And if the UK closes the border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK, making travelers from Belfast go through customs if they take a ferry to Liverpool or fly to Heathrow, then the UK is dividing itself into two and making it more likely that Ulster will one day separate from Great Britain and join the Republic of Ireland. This is the solution adopted by Boris Johnson's government. Ulster Unionists have protested, but they, much like imperialists more generally in Britain, lack the power they once did.